On the 12th of February 1554, inside the walls of the Tower of London, a young woman of around 16 years old made her way to her execution. She was not just a commoner. This was someone who would, in years later, become known as the 9 Days Queen for the fact she reigned over England between the 10th and the 19th of July. Jane Grey today is considered a woman who was a victim of the infamous Bloody Mary I, and also the manipulations of men who wanted to gain power through her. She had royal blood, and there were many who were willing to exploit that and her so they could gain more power for themselves. But the execution of Lady Jane Grey was harrowing, brutal, and shocking. But why was it so bad? Lady Jane Grey was the great-granddaughter of Henry VII, and she had royal blood through his youngest daughter Mary, and she was also a great-niece of the infamous six-wifed King Henry VIII. She was a cousin to Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I, and Jane was in line to the throne of England following her cousins, but she was bumped up the list by her cousin Edward VI, who did not want his half-sisters Mary or Elizabeth taking the throne. Following Edward's death, Lady Jane Grey was brought to London, and specifically the Tower of London, and she was proclaimed the Queen on the 10th of July 1553, and she was inside the Tower awaiting her coronation. She had previously married Guildford Dudley, the son of the powerful Duke of Northumberland, John Dudley, a man obsessed with power. Whilst Jane was awaiting her coronation, she signed a number of letters with Jane the Queen, and this was then later used against her as evidence that she had therefore accepted the role of queen. But there was an uprising beginning as Princess Mary, the future Mary I, would build up an army, and quickly the Privy Council, fearing their lives, abandoned Jane and supported Mary, meaning that Jane was now on her own. Mary succeeded to the throne and was proclaimed the rightful queen, and with this, Lady Jane now became a prisoner inside of the Tower. She was imprisoned inside of the gentleman's jailer's apartments, and her husband Guildford was locked up inside the bell tower. Lady Jane was then accused of high treason and was charged with this and stood trial at the Guildhall in the City of London. The trial went as expected, and she was found guilty and was then sentenced to death. Jane was someone whom Mary knew very well, and they had mixed in royal circles for many years as younger children and women, but the trial stated that Jane's punishment was to be burned alive on Tower Hill or beheaded as the Queen pleases. So the life of Jane was to be ended and decided upon by the Queen. Some reported that Jane had actually been spared and that Mary took pity upon her, and this would explain the delay with Jane's execution. Mary I thought correctly that Jane and her husband were pawns in the manipulations of other men, and in particular the Duke of Northumberland, who was beheaded on Tower Hill, but following another rebellion breaking out in January of 1554, Mary was convinced to execute Lady Jane. Jane's father had been part of the rebellion, but it did trouble her to let her cousin die, and she was advised by the Privy Council to execute her. With this, it's interesting, as we know that the woman who would later be known as Bloody Mary wanted to spare her cousin and not execute her, and she had reservations around this. Jane was to lose her head, and the execution was first scheduled for the 9th of February 1554, but was then postponed for 3 days to allow Jane to convert to the Catholic faith. Jane did not want to do this. However, on the day before her execution, Guildford asked to meet with Jane, but she refused as she knew it would increase their misery and pain, and it was better to put it off, as they would meet shortly elsewhere and live bound by indissoluble ties. Then, on the morning of the 12th of February 1554, Guildford Dudley, Jane's husband, was taken from his rooms up to Tower Hill, a short walk north of the Tower's walls, to be executed by beheading. Shortly later, Jane, standing looking out at one of the windows, noticed her husband's headless corpse and his head being brought back on via horse and cart into the Tower for burial. She screamed his name, but it was then her turn. Lady Jane was walked out to the execution scaffold, which stood on the north side of the White Tower, the central fortress within the tower's walls. She was helped up onto it, and there were a few witnesses gathered to see the proceedings. She gave a short speech saying, "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to the same. The fact, indeed, against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consented thereunto by me, by touching the procurement and desire thereof by me or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency, before God and the face of you, good Christian people, this day." She did not admit to any crimes specifically, but did say, "I do wash my hands thereof in innocence," and she recited a psalm and then passed over her gloves and handkerchief to a maid. Stood also on the scaffold was an executioner who was armed with an axe, and Jane asked him, "I pray you dispatch me quickly," and she asked, "Will you take my head off before I lay down?" The executioner replied with, "No, madam." She was blindfolded by herself, and Jane then, who had previously gone to her execution with calm and grace, began to panic. She could not find the block to rest her head on, and she cried out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" before the Deputy Lieutenant of the Tower of London guided her head on the block. Her final words were, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." And the executioner then struck his axe down on the 16 or 17-year-old woman's neck, and in one blow her head was taken off. Lady Jane Grey was then buried inside the Tower of London's chapel. The harrowing element of her execution is the fact that she was so young, just a teenager when she was executed in private within the fortress. She was someone who accepted the role of queen reluctantly, despite the fact she was never coronated, and she should really be remembered as a Tudor queen alongside Mary I and Elizabeth I, as she was in fact a queen. Thank you for watching, and to support our channel, please subscribe. And again, thank you so much for watching.